This is truly a breathtaking expansion of police power.
44 days after the September 11th attacks, during a debate on the USA PATRIOT Act, Senator Russ Feingold delivered this warning to lawmakers.
We must examine every item that is proposed in response to these events to be sure that we are not rewarding these terrorists and weakening ourselves by giving up the cherished freedoms that they seek to destroy.
One of those freedoms facing disruption was privacy. And though the Constitution doesn't explicitly guarantee a right to privacy, it seems clear now, 20 years later, Russ Feingold's fears were justified.
There is no doubt that if we lived in a police state, it would be easier to catch terrorists.
On October 25, 2001, U.S. senators voted on the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act of 2001. The Patriot Act, according to supporters, expanded law enforcement's ability to use technology to hunt down and combat terrorists. Critics say these expanded abilities extended too much authority to police, allowing them to legally violate constitutionally protected rights.
I felt that the American people had been attacked in a brutal and unfair and unjustified way. And that my job was to try to do the right thing in the Senate to try to respond to that. And that just didn't mean trying to get the bad guys, it did. But it also meant sticking to our values, because otherwise the terrorists really do win.
And the bill is passed.
In the Senate, the Patriot Act passed 98-1. The only person who voted no, Russ Feingold.
I was really thinking about what happens in a moment when there's a crisis, when there's an enormous amount of fear.
Fear is primitive, one of terrorism's key ingredients. Vocabulary.com calls terrorism violence or the threat of violence directed against civilians for the purpose of creating intense fear, which the terrorist hopes to exploit to attain political or ideological goals. This means responding to terrorism requires fighting two enemies at the same time: the terrorists who commit violence and fear, the invisible weapon that hijacks our emotions and pushes us to make impulsive decisions. In the U.S., policies aimed at providing security have been influenced by fear in the past.
The Alien and Sedition Acts, the suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War, the internment of Japanese Americans, German Americans, and Italian Americans during World War II, the blacklisting of supposed communist sympathizers during the McCarthy era, and the surveillance and harassment of anti-war protesters, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the Vietnam War. We must not allow these pieces of our past to become prologue.
Senator Feingold raises some very important points on the history here, because a lot of the debate about surveillance powers is often resting on the assumption that it will be used properly and that only good and wise people will use these powers. And history shows that's not the case.
The Electronic Frontier Foundation says it's important to preserve your rights while you're online, including your privacy, everything from your emails to your Google search history.
Privacy is an important part of who you are. In some sense, the right to be left alone, the ability to have your own thoughts and beliefs without someone looking over your shoulder. You can see from time to time there'll be a data breach where somebody's emails come out, and a lot of things get taken out of context, looked at in isolation, but paint a very different picture than they may see themselves. So I think we all have some need to have that private space and preserve it.
Today, most people place some value on their privacy. But before the 20th century, there was no legal consensus on a right to privacy.
One thing that's not always appreciated is that the United States really gave birth to modern privacy law in the beginning of the 20th century.
In 1890, Louis Brandeis and Samuel Warren wrote The Right to Privacy, where they assert that having a right to life means having a right to be left alone. The end of the 19th century was a time of technological progress. Sound recorders and film cameras were becoming popular. Brandeis argued publishers of the day were profiting from this tech by incentivizing intrusion into the lives of innocent people by commodifying their photos and recorded conversations. Brandeis argued privacy, like property, is one of many aspects of the common right to life. In fewer words, the law was behind technology, much like today.
I think that our laws in the United States in particular have not been updated meaningfully since essentially the mid-'80s, somewhat in the early '90s.
Epic's executive director, Alan Butler, says today it's not just governments who collect your information, but also global tech companies. He says our laws need to catch up.
At the federal level, we've seen a lack of leadership where we need fundamental baseline privacy legislation that protects all Americans. And we do not currently have that. And so we've really fallen behind in the last 20 years, which has been a critical period, right? It's been a period of rapid exponential technological change. And we've seen the emergence of devices and technologies and the emergence of online services that fundamentally changed the game in terms of how you need to approach protecting privacy and personal data. And the law has to be updated to reflect that.
In 2018, the European Union passed the General Data Protection Regulation. It gives European citizens new rights and more control over their info, including how it's used by tech companies and who gets to see it. The GDPR's inspired modern privacy legislation around the world, like the US did in the 20th century. But here at home, there's still no federal law extending similar data privacy rights to Americans, so states have started making their own. California, Colorado, and Virginia have passed privacy bills that give residents more control over their data. Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania are currently discussing privacy laws. And in 16 states, laws have been introduced but failed to pass.
Well, this is almost inevitable. Technology is also going to always move faster than the law.
This brings us back to the Patriot Act. In the last 20 years, federal courts have ruled some of the Patriot Act's provisions were unconstitutional. And Russ Feingold lost his Senate seat in 2011. His Republican opponent weaponized that vote against the Patriot Act, calling him soft on terrorists.
Only one senator voted no, Russ Feingold.
But like most good stories, there's a twist. The Patriot Act, created by a Republican White House in 2001, was finally ended by a Republican president. In 2020, when the bill was up for renewal, President Trump threatened to veto, so Congress allowed it to expire.
With a divided political world, often their view about whether these powers are overbroad or wisely used will depend on whether it's their political party in power or it's the opposing political party in power.
Both the EFF and Epic describe the last 20 years as a pendulum swing between two states, first toward a police state, then back toward a democratic one. In that 2001 Senate speech, Feingold explained the difference.
If we lived in a police state, it would be easier to catch terrorists. If we lived in a country that simply allowed the police to search your home at any time for any reason, if we lived in a country that allowed the government to open your mail, eavesdrop on your phone conversations, or intercept your email communications, if we lived in a country that allowed the government to hold people in jail indefinitely based on what they write or think, or based on mere suspicion that they're up to no good, then the government would no doubt discover and arrest more terrorists. That country would not be America.
I treasure whatever privacy I have, but it's just one of those things where if things can pick up everything you say and everything you do, we have to fight for it. But frankly, I don't have the technical abilities and capacities to understand all of this. And I'm going to leave it to your generation and other generations to figure it out. But please don't give up on personal privacy. It is a very important part of life.